Boop. Happy Wednesday. Today is Wednesday, September 9th, 2020. Today's daily Bible readings come to us from Psalm 121, Exodus 13, 1 through 10, Matthew 21, 18 through 22, or you could have read Psalm 119, 65 through 72, Leviticus 16, 1 through 5, and also 20 through 28, and then Matthew once again 21, 18 through 22. And today I'm going to focus on this section from Matthew, and I want to talk about, ask what's up about chucking mountains. Because this is where Jesus says this kind of cryptic thing that people are like, wow, he says that if we have faith, we can say, you can toss mountains into the sea. Now, before you get all excited about that, he is not telling you to go practice your earthbending skills. That is not what Jesus is talking about here. And if you thought that's what he was talking about, I am sorry to burst your bubble. So what's it all about? What's all this about chucking mountains all about? Well, he's talking about a specific mountain and a very specific situation. So what is he talking about? Well, okay, let's talk about what happens before this issue of tables and donkeys and doves and figs. This section in Matthew, what happens right before this is Jesus' triumphal entry earlier in chapter 21. And if you've been to church, I assume, on Palm Sunday, rather. And so you know that's when we remember Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, right? Where he sends his disciples out to go get a donkey, or I guess he got called an Uber donkey, or maybe it was a Lyft donkey, I don't know. And this donkey shows up and he rides the donkey into Jerusalem. Okay, well, why the donkey? Well, it's a reference to Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 9. You can go look it up if you don't believe me. Where it says, here comes your Lord, humble and riding to you on a donkey, right? That's what that basically says. So that's what happens right before this. He comes into Jerusalem as their new king, and everybody's like, oh, yay, awesome, he's coming to us. And why that's important is because that passage in Zechariah it's all about God finally being good to Judah and finally taking care of all their enemies and finally bringing an end to their punishment and their sufferings and being gentle to them. Well, so that's why everybody's excited. But the very next thing Jesus does in Matthew's account of this account also, if you want to, you can go look at Mark and see how he tells the story. The very next thing he does is go to the temple and start flipping tables, right? He's a table bender. Anyway, so he starts flipping tables around, and it tells us specifically he targets the people who are exchanging money and the people who were selling doves. So what's that all about? Well, okay, so I've explained this before. I think I may have talked about this earlier. I'm pretty sure I did, because earlier in the year, of course, it actually was Holy Week and Palm Sunday, so we probably talked about this before. If I repeat myself, I'm sorry, but if you probably don't remember watching that video, or you didn't watch it. So anyway, I'm just going to keep talking. So he's flipping the table of the money changers and the doves. So if you've ever been to Chuck E. Cheese, and I know you have, you realize that when you go to Chuck E. Cheese, you can't just use your own money in their machines. No, you actually have to take your money and go to the counter and buy their money so you can use it in their fancy Chuck E. Cheese machines. Now, the temple was nothing like Chuck E. Cheese. They did not have pizza. But they did have money exchanges because you couldn't use the coins of the realm, right? You couldn't use the coin that had Nero's face on it to buy things in the temple because it had Nero's face on it, and that was idolatry. So you had to actually exchange it for a temple coin. Well, you could cheat people on the value of that coin. In reality, that temple coin may have been worth the same amount or actually less than the coin of the realm. But you could say, no, it's going to cost you 2 Caesars for 1 shekel. And they had to pay it, because if they wanted to go the next step, which was buy things to sacrifice, like a dove, they had to do that. And then, so why specifically the doves? Well, here's the deal. If you go back and you read Leviticus, which you should always be doing, because Leviticus is, a hot topic. If you go back and you read Leviticus, one of the things you realize, because you so thoroughly read it, is that doves were a part of the sacrificial process, right? They were animals that were acceptable as sacrifice, but specifically, they were kind of reserved for people who couldn't afford something like a sheep or a goat or a heifer or things like that. So it was reserved as a sacrifice for the poor. So people like the lepers whom Jesus had healed, and he told them to go present themselves at the temple. The understanding is that they would go present themselves to the priest, and the priest would proclaim them clean, and then they would offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving so that they could be restored to the fellowship of faith, so that they could be reconciled back to God, right? Not God reconciling himself to them, but them reconciled to God. And also women who had just had children, they would go present this sacrifice after the end of all that for their ritual cleansing. And we're told in Leviticus 12:8 that if the woman is too poor to be able to afford like a lamb or sheep, that she could, because I think the prescription was a lamb and a turtle dove. But if she was too poor, she couldn't afford that, she could just do 2 doves or 2 pigeons. And we're actually told in Luke tells us that was the sacrifice that Mary brought with her when she brought her infant son Jesus. So that tells you something that Jesus' family couldn't afford to bring a sheep, that's the sacrifice his own mother was able to offer, right? And so, cheating people on that money, right? So if you've got some guy or some woman who's had leprosy, or a woman who's just had a child and is trying to, access the temple and access the community of faith once again, and you cheat them on the cost of the money, first of all, right? They go and they think they've got enough to buy like 2 turtle doves, and so you cheat them, and suddenly they've got enough just to barely squeak by and maybe get 2 that aren't really particularly great shape. And then they get to the seller of dove, and they're either selling really bad stuff or they're cheating people on the price of that. You've kept people away from the altar, right? So, cheating people on the cost and on the value of the money isolates people from God's altar, isolates them from God's presence. And so the altar itself existed so that people might be reconciled to God. That's the whole reason that it's there. And then we get into this, this whole thing about the fig, which is another thing that just throws people off, because Jesus leaves and he comes back the next day, and on his way in, it says he was hungry, and he comes up on this fig tree and there's no fruit on it. He's like, fig, like, what the heck? There's no figs on this tree. And he curses the fig right then and there. It's a little bit different in Mark, but it's the same idea. And the fig dies. The fig tree dies right there. And his disciples are shocked. And that's when they get into this conversation. And he says, I tell you, if you have faith, you can say, well, I'll just read it here. How did the fig tree wither at once? Jesus answered them, truly, I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, it will be done. Whatever you ask for in prayer with faith, you will receive. So here you have Jesus. He's entered the city as this triumphal king, and he's gone to the temple, and he finds it to be a filthy place. As it says, this is supposed to be a house of prayer for the nations, but you've turned it into a den of thieves. And he comes back the next day and he's hungry. I don't think he was just hungry for figs. I think he was hungry for the righteousness of his people and for the righteousness of that house. And when he saw how corrupt it was, it bothered him, right? And so here we have him cursing a fig tree because it didn't bear fruit. But the day before, he had found it wasn't even that the temple wasn't producing fruit. It was a very active place. People were coming and going and offering sacrifices, but the fruit it was bearing was corrupt. it was no longer serving its purpose the way it should. And like I said, that purpose was to reconcile people to their God. And so when he says to this mountain, it's not just, like I said, being able to have faith so strong that you can do miraculous things. Sorry about my computer notifying me there. It's not just about that. It's about that he is saying to this mountain that your purpose is done. This way is, you no longer serve your purpose, and so I don't need you anymore. You just don't need this anymore. It's not just that he's throwing out a mountain. Jesus is throwing out a whole way of experiencing God, a whole way of being reconciled to God, because it had no longer served its purpose. So that's the DBR for today. We'll be back tomorrow. You have a good afternoon and a good evening. We'll talk to you later. Boop.